On April 9, 2009, 42-year-old Abraham Shakespeare drove his fancy black BMW 750i car towards an upscale gated community in Lakeland, Florida. Abraham stopped his car, hit a remote control on his sun visor, and waited for the large gate that kept his neighborhood separated from the rest of the city to open. Then Abraham drove through the gate and glanced in his rearview mirror. His friend, Dee Dee Moore, was following right behind him in her black Hummer. Abraham led Dee Dee through the neighborhood's winding roads that were dotted with large two-story homes with huge front yards and swimming pools in back. Then he pulled into the driveway of his own house that looked a lot like the others in the neighborhood. Abraham parked his car and stepped outside. He was 6 foot 4 inches tall with long, skinny arms and legs. He had a beard and a black spandex cap that covered his dreadlocks. He wore a white t-shirt and jeans. Dee Dee's huge Hummer pulled into the driveway behind the BMW. Dee Dee got out and smiled at Abraham. She was 36 years old, and she was tall with dyed blonde hair, and she laughed and talked a lot. Dee Dee went around to the passenger side of the Hummer, opened the door, and took out a video camera and a tripod to put the camera on. She closed the door and then followed Abraham into his house. And Abraham led her through his living room that had high ceilings, large leather couches, and a state-of-the-art TV. The furniture, and most of the decorations inside, had come with the house when Abraham bought it. Abraham asked Dee Dee how her day at work had been as they walked up the staircase to the second floor. And Dee Dee told him that things were going really well. She owned and operated a successful medical staffing agency, and she said business just kept getting better. Then they walked down a hallway on the second floor into a room that Abraham used as an office and as a place to relax and watch TV. And when they walked into the room, Dee Dee set up the tripod, put the camera on it, and turned the camera on. Then she asked Abraham if he was ready for her to film him. Abraham looked at the camera, he grinned and said yep, he was ready. Since Dee Dee's medical staffing agency had taken off, she had spent a lot of time and energy following her dream of becoming a writer. She wanted to write books and movies. And when Dee Dee and Abraham had met through a mutual friend about 6 months earlier, she was fascinated by his life story. And she thought he would be the perfect subject for a biography or a documentary, or maybe even a Hollywood blockbuster movie. Dee Dee pressed record on the camera and asked Abraham just to talk about himself a little bit and to tell her about his life. Dee Dee thought getting Abraham to tell his story in his own words would be a great resource for her for when she started writing a book or movie about him. So Abraham started talking into the camera and pacing a little back and forth, and as he talked about his life, it seemed like he was almost reliving certain moments from when he was younger. And that made Dee Dee smile. And as she listened, she thought even his last name, Shakespeare, was perfect for a storyteller like Abraham. Abraham had grown up poor, and he had dropped out of school when he was about 12 years old to go work in the citrus fields that thrived in that part of Florida. And Abraham had left school without really learning how to read or write beyond the most basic level. And as he got older, he started to understand that his employment options would always be limited. And so he had spent the majority of his life moving from one odd job to another, trying to make ends meet. In the room upstairs in his house, Abraham stopped pacing for a second, and he thought back to some of the low-paying jobs he'd had. And he said going from job to job and struggling to survive had made it clear to him just how much the city of Lakeland was divided. Lakeland was part of the Tampa Bay area, and in Lakeland, some of the wealthiest people in Florida lived just miles away from some of the poorest people. And Abraham said when he was younger, he would pass by the gated communities where the rich people lived, and he would tell himself that someday he would figure out a way to move behind those gates. But it was a dream that most people in his poor neighborhood laughed at, and for most of Abraham's life, that dream he had seemed like it was impossible to achieve. But even though Abraham had spent decades living in his mom's house and working low-paying jobs, he had refused to let that bring him down. And everybody who knew Abraham said he was one of the kindest, most positive people they had ever met. Then, 3 years earlier, on November 15th of 2006, Abraham had been working as a delivery man for a food distribution company. Abraham's coworker, Michael Ford, had been driving the delivery truck that day, and he pulled into a convenience store to get cigarettes and a drink. But before Michael got out of the truck, Abraham had reached into his pocket and taken out $2. Abraham was pretty broke at the time, and he knew he shouldn't just throw money away, but he stared at the dollar bills in his hand and then gave them to Michael and asked him to buy 2 quick pick lottery tickets. and Michael laughed, grabbed the money, and went inside. A few minutes later, Michael had gotten back in the truck and given Abraham the 2 lottery tickets. Then, the following evening, Abraham had been sitting on the couch at his mother's house, watching the winning lottery numbers get announced on the local news. And he had just stared at the TV, stunned, because each winning lottery number that just got announced matched a number on a lottery ticket he was holding. At first, as the numbers kept matching over and over again, Abraham had kind of laughed it off and thought, this is not going to happen. But when they were about to announce the final number, he could feel his heart beating faster, because all he needed was one more match. He leaned in close to the TV and watched as the newscaster called out the final winning lottery number. And when Abraham had heard that number, he checked his ticket, then he checked it again and again. And then Abraham jumped off the couch and started shouting to his mother that he had just won the lottery. Abraham's mom came into the room and she thought he was playing a prank. But when he showed her the numbers on the TV and the matching numbers on his ticket, she started screaming and crying because Abraham had hit the $30 million jackpot. Fast forward back to the present, and Abraham smiled into the camera, and Dee Dee smiled too. Just hearing Abraham tell that story about winning the lottery was like listening to somebody describe a miracle, like something that never really actually happens in real life. But then Abraham stared down at the floor, and a look of total exhaustion came across his face. So Dee Dee asked him if he was okay, and Abraham told Dee Dee about what had happened almost immediately after he was shown on the TV collecting his big lottery winnings. Even after a huge amount of taxes and a reduced payout for taking his lottery money immediately instead of over several years, Abraham walked away with about $12 million, more money than he'd ever imagined having in his whole life. And with that money, Abraham had bought his dream house in one of Lakeland's beautiful gated communities for the rich, and he had gotten himself a very fancy car, that BMW. But soon after that, a lot of people had seemed to take advantage of Abraham's kindness. And he was lending money to friends, family, and people he had never met before, and he was paying for their mortgages, healthcare bills, college tuition fees, startup expenses for businesses, and just about anything else people could think of. And Abraham said that he loved helping people, he really did. But over time, it had just gotten more out of control, and now, 2.5 years after he had won the lottery, he said there were days where he would get hundreds of text messages from people asking for money, and he just felt like he couldn't say no to any of them. In fact, Abraham had a cousin named Cedric who owed him thousands of dollars in mortgage payments on a house that Abraham had bought and let Cedric live in. And now Abraham could barely even get Cedric to talk to him, let alone get Cedric to pay back any of the money he owed. And Abraham hated that he felt like his lottery money was coming between him and his friends and family. From behind the camera, Dee Dee asked Abraham if he was tired, and he turned away from the lens, then glanced back and said he'd been tired for a whole year. And he said sometimes he dreamed of running away to a beach in some other country and just disappearing forever. Not long after that, Dee Dee stopped recording. She could tell Abraham was getting upset, and she felt for him. She hadn't won millions of dollars, but she said when her business had taken off, she had her share of people coming out of the woodwork asking her for money, and she knew that even for someone who was as good of a person as Abraham, that pressure could take its toll. And so Abraham and Dee Dee had talked for a little while longer, but not for the camera. And then at some point, Abraham looked around the room and then stared out the window at his sprawling yard. Abraham lived in a place he'd once dreamed about, and now all he wanted to do was get as far away from that house as possible. And after this day, April 9th, 2009, when Abraham and Dee Dee chatted and Abraham spoke for the camera, Abraham just kind of disappeared. And in the days and weeks following this day, Dee Dee, Abraham's mom, and some of his other close friends and family did get occasional text messages from Abraham, but nobody saw him or talked to him on the phone, and in the text messages he sent, Abraham always said that he was doing fine and he just wanted to be left alone, but he never said where he actually was. And so Abraham's apparent decision to just leave without telling anyone really upset his mom. They had always been really close, and she had talked to Abraham almost every day for his entire life. So now only getting a few text messages from him every now and again with kind of sparse information about what he was doing and where he was very difficult for her to deal with. But like Dee Dee, Abraham's mom had seen up close how people constantly came to Abraham for money and how that really weighed on him. And she knew Abraham had started to imagine himself walking on a beach where nobody knew who he was and where nobody would bother him. And so Abraham's mom and his other family and friends didn't try to find him. They just kind of respected that he really just wanted space. But then, fast forward to November 9th, 2009, 7 months after Abraham was last seen by anybody close to him. And on that day, Detective Dave Clark of the Polk County Sheriff's Department was sitting at his desk looking at a report that didn't make sense to him. The Sheriff's Department had gotten a call from Cedric Edom, Abraham's cousin who owed him thousands of dollars. And Cedric had said that his cousin had been missing since April and he wanted to file an official missing persons report. Detective Clark, who had short blonde hair and a goatee, looked really young, but in reality, he had been in law enforcement for years, and he had experience with almost every kind of case. And Clark had a reputation for being one of the best listeners and one of the most objective officers in the entire department. In fact, during interrogations, Clark was known to give suspects every chance to tell their side of a story because he genuinely believed in the assumption that people were innocent until proven guilty. But as much as Clark had seen over the years, and as much as he tried to give people the benefit of the doubt, something about this missing persons report felt really strange to him. If this man was missing, why had his friends and family waited 7 months to tell the police? Clark leaned back in his chair and read over the report again. And this time, when he read the missing person's name, his eyes went wide. He grabbed a piece of paper and pen and started writing down some notes. Because Clark remembered something that he hadn't thought of in years. Clark knew who Abraham Shakespeare was, because after Abraham had hit the lottery jackpot back in 2006, news stations in the area covered what they called Abraham's rags to riches story over and over for weeks. So Clark now knew he was dealing with a potentially missing person who was worth millions and millions of dollars. And when that much money was involved, there was always the possibility of foul play. And so Clark wanted to get to work on this case right away, and he wanted to start his investigation with the man who had filed the missing persons report, because Clark was interested in finding out why, after all this time, Cedric had now decided to come forward and track down his cousin. A few hours later, Detective Clark led Abraham's cousin, Cedric, into an interrogation room at the sheriff's department, and Cedric was combative almost from the moment he walked in. He told Clark he didn't understand why he was being questioned, and he said he was the only one who seemed concerned at all about Abraham. But Clark just smiled and asked Cedric to sit down with him at a small table in the cramped, bright room. And then Clark said that they had contacted Cedric and asked him to come in because he was the one who had contacted them. And the police really just wanted to know what was going on with Abraham that had concerned Cedric enough to get in touch with authorities. Cedric took a breath and tried to calm down, but it didn't work. And in a very angry voice, he launched into an attack against a bunch of Abraham's friends, including Dee Dee Moore, and he said they were all really greedy people who took advantage of Abraham. And then Cedric said he was almost positive that one of them had killed Abraham and taken off with his money. Clark listened and let Cedric talk for as long as he wanted. And Clark thought it was a little weird how quickly Cedric had jumped to the conclusion that Abraham had been murdered, but Clark didn't mention that. And when Cedric finally stopped talking, Clark smiled and talked to Cedric almost like they'd been friends for years. Clark said he'd done some research right after getting the missing persons report, and so he knew that Cedric owed Abraham thousands of dollars in mortgage payments on a house that Abraham had bought for him. Cedric shook his head, and the anger in his voice came right back. And he said he loved his cousin, and he reiterated that he was the only one doing anything to find him. By the end of the interview, Clark was even more surprised than he had been by the missing persons report. He didn't have enough evidence to hold Cedric, but he thought if something really had happened to Abraham, Cedric had to be at the top of the suspect list. Here was a guy who hadn't said anything for 7 months, who owed Abraham thousands of dollars, talked about a potential murder, and then immediately tried to put the blame on other people. So Clark couldn't shake the feeling that Cedric might have contacted police in an attempt to cover his own tracks in some way. But Clark was going to remain objective like he always did, and even if he was potentially connected to Abraham's disappearance, there was also a chance that he was telling the truth. And so maybe there really were friends of Abraham who were out to get his money in any way possible. So later that day, the sheriff's department subpoenaed the cell phone company in order to get a detailed account of Abraham's cell phone records. But Clark knew that could take a while, so he dug further into some of Abraham's financial records, and the list of people who owed him money was astonishing. In the 3 years since Abraham won the lottery, he had loaned millions of dollars to people. And this was just in the form of property expenses, medical bills, educational costs, and other loans that had a clear paper trail. But Clark figured Abraham must have also been handing out money to people in his everyday life that he had not kept records of. So, tracking down all the people who owed Abraham money would take time and resources. Clark was willing to do whatever it took, but he still had no evidence, other than Cedric's word, that Abraham was actually missing. Clark needed to get a better idea of what was happening, so he decided to talk directly to one of the people that Cedric had been eager to blame for Abraham's disappearance, Dee Moore. On November 10th, the day after the missing persons report had been filed, Detective Clark found himself back in the interrogation room. This time, he was seated across the table from Dee Moore, Abraham's friend who wanted to write a book and make a movie about his life. Dee had on jeans, a t-shirt, and leather sandals, and Clark thought she was almost the exact opposite of Cedric when it came to interviewing her. She smiled a bunch and seemed very easygoing, and she said she would tell him anything she could, but that she didn't really understand why she was there. So Clark asked her, when was the last time you spoke to Abraham? And she said she had gotten a text from him somewhat recently, and that he messaged her from time to time just to see how things were going in her life and to tell her that he was okay and enjoying his time away. Then Clark took a breath and got a serious look on his face. He looked right at Dee and told her that Abraham's cousin, Cedric, had said he was worried Abraham might be dead. Dee immediately looked confused and said she didn't understand because as far as she knew, she was texting somewhat regularly with Abraham. And as far as she knew, Abraham had done exactly what he said he was going to do, take off to maybe a beach somewhere and never look back. So Clark asked her why Cedric would have filed the missing persons report in the first place and why he might have pointed the finger at her as someone who might have wanted to hurt Abraham. Dee just shook her head, and then she looked at Clark and said she had an idea why Cedric might come after her. Clark smiled, and in his friendly voice, he asked Dee to fill him in. And Dee said that she and Abraham's mom were two of the only people in his life who had pushed Abraham to follow up with everyone who owed him money and make them pay him back. They said it was one thing to be a kind person, but it was another to get taken advantage of. And they told Abraham that just because someone was family, it didn't mean they were entitled to get anything they wanted from him. Clark nodded and asked if that had caused problems in Abraham's life, having people like Cedric around. And Dee's voice got a little louder and rougher, and she said Cedric preyed on good-hearted people. And she knew that as much as Abraham wanted to see the best in others, Cedric would never pay him back a dime. Detective Clark and Dee spoke for a little while longer, and then Clark thanked her for her time, and after she left, he went back to his desk to look at his notes from both of the interviews he'd conducted over the past couple of days. And as he did that, all he could think about was how badly he wanted to see Abraham's cell phone records. Because Clark still didn't know if Abraham was dead in a ditch somewhere, like Cedric wanted him to believe, or if Abraham was just sipping piña coladas on a beach without a care in the world. In the days following his interview with Dee, Clark kept digging into Abraham's financial records, and he and other members of the investigative team met with Abraham's friends, family, and as many people who owed him money as possible. But Clark also discovered something new that caught his interest. Michael Ford, Abraham's coworker who had used Abraham's money to buy the winning lottery tickets, had filed a lawsuit about a year after Abraham had won the lottery. In that lawsuit, Michael had argued that because he was the one who actually bought the tickets for Abraham, he was entitled to at least a cut of the winnings. But Michael had lost his case in court, and Clark wanted to know if maybe Michael held a grudge against Abraham. So Clark pursued this new potential lead. But he discovered that Michael and Abraham had pretty much lost touch once the trial started, and Abraham had even stated publicly that he didn't blame Michael for doing what he did. and he said he would have been willing to give Michael hundreds of thousands of dollars if Michael had just asked him, instead of going directly to the courts. Now, none of this ruled out Michael as a suspect in Clark's mind, but there was no evidence putting Michael anywhere near Abraham in the days and weeks before Abraham had apparently disappeared. So Clark knew he needed to keep looking elsewhere. And Clark still felt like he was in the middle of one of the most bizarre cases he'd ever dealt with, because no evidence had surfaced that suggested anything violent or against the law had even happened to Abraham. There was no body, there was no signs of distress at his house, and friends and family kept getting text messages from him. So Clark kept reminding himself that Abraham was a guy with the financial means to truly just disappear if he wanted to. But then, at the end of the month, something happened that would turn Detective Clark's attention back to one suspect in particular. On a day in late November, Abraham's mom contacted Detective Clark and said she had something to show him. So Clark drove out to her house, and Abraham's mom met him at the door and invited him inside. The house was warm and comfortable, and being there, Clark felt even more of an urge to discover where Abraham was, just so he could put Abraham's mom's mind at ease. Clark thanked Abraham's mom for calling him and for welcoming him into her house. Then she led him into the living room and picked up an envelope from the coffee table. She opened it and showed Clark a greeting card with a Christian cross on the front. And she said when she'd gotten this card, there had been a $100 bill inside of it. She handed the card to Clark and he opened it, and he saw a scribbled note that said, "I'll be home soon," and Abraham's signature underneath. And Abraham's mom said that even though her son had trouble writing, he had always made sure he could sign his name, and she recognized that was definitely his signature on the card. Abraham's mom told Clark that she had gotten the letter about 2 months earlier, but she had forgotten about it. She said she was sorry she had not shown it to him sooner. Clark said that was totally fine, and that he was grateful that she was showing it to him now. And he picked up the envelope that the card had come in, and he squinted his eyes, almost like he was trying to look for something that wasn't there, because there was no stamp or address on the envelope, and it didn't look like it had been mailed from anywhere. So Clark asked Abraham's mom how she'd actually gotten the letter, and she told him her nephew, Abraham's cousin, Cedric, had hand-delivered it. Just hearing that made Clark feel like his investigation had gone right back to where it started. Then, without Clark saying anything, Abraham's mom said that even though Cedric was her nephew, she didn't always trust him. And she didn't necessarily believe he was just trying to do right by Abraham by filing the missing persons report. And then she looked Clark in the eyes and told him all she really wanted was to hear from her son. If she could just hear his voice, she would know he was okay and everything would be fine. Clark said he understood, and he thanked Abraham's mom for all her help and told her he would keep her informed if he learned anything new. Then Clark went back to the station and he told other members of the investigative team that he wanted to keep looking into Abraham's cousin, Cedric, because giving Abraham's mom a card with $100 and Abraham's signature in it seemed like one more way Cedric could be trying to cover something up. And then Clark got some information that he was confident would break the case wide open. The phone company had come back and they provided police with a detailed history of text messages sent from Abraham's number. And something in those text messages stood out to Clark right away. And by December, Clark believed he was closer than ever to finding Abraham. On December 26, 2009, so a month and a half after the missing persons report was filed, Abraham's mother was relaxing on the couch at her house. Christmas had been a mixed blessing that year. She loved seeing friends and family for the holidays, but not having Abraham around just hadn't felt right. They had always spent Christmas together, and so the house kind of felt empty without him. But then her phone rang. She leaned over, grabbed it off the coffee table, and almost started crying tears of joy because Abraham was calling. The connection wasn't great, but she could hear her son on the other line, and that was all that mattered. Abraham wished her a Merry Christmas and said he was sorry he hadn't called the day before. And Abraham's mom said that was okay and that she just wanted to know how he was doing. And he said other than dealing with a little winter cold, he'd been great. And he knew him leaving had been very hard on people, especially her, but he felt like he'd made the right choice. And he promised he'd be home soon, and when he did, he'd be much happier than when he left. Abraham's mom hung up the phone, and she felt better than she had in months. And she wanted to call everyone she knew to let them know the good news. She had finally heard from Abraham. She had heard his voice. But first, she thought she needed to tell the police. So she took a deep breath, collected herself, and called the sheriff's department. On December 26th, right after Abraham's mom had gotten this call from her son, Detective Clark was sitting at his desk. His phone rang, and he picked it up, and he could hear Abraham's mom almost shouting at him on the other line. She told him about the phone call she'd just received from Abraham and how happy she was, and so Clark thanked her for letting him know, he wished her a Merry Christmas, and then hung up. But then, he immediately made a call to the cell phone company so he could get a location on where Abraham's phone had been when he placed this call to his mother. And when Clark heard what they had to say, he shouted across the room to a fellow detective and told him they needed to leave immediately. Clark and this other detective ran out of the station. They climbed into an unmarked car, Clark sat in the passenger seat, and the other detective drove, and before long they were peeling out of the parking lot and heading onto the street. It was a mild winter day in Florida, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, but the sun was bright and Clark could feel himself sweating a little from the adrenaline rush. Minutes later, they pulled off the road and into a parking lot of a huge shopping mall. And when they arrived, Clark and the other detective saw the man they were looking for sitting in a parked car nearby. But before the detectives could get out of their car, the man they were looking for drove off. And so Clark looked over at the other detective and just said, "Chase him." So the detective peeled out of the mall parking lot and raced down the street after this man in the car. But the detectives realized they didn't have police sirens in their unmarked vehicle, so they couldn't signal to the driver that they were cops and they wanted to pull him over. So the detective just tried to stay as close to the man they were chasing as possible. Then finally they came to a red light and the man they were after stopped, and so without even thinking, Detective Clark threw open his door, he ran in front of this car, he held up his badge, and he yelled at the driver to get out and come with them. The man in this car just stared up at Clark, and then he slumped his shoulders and put his head down. And later that day, after they had all talked back at the sheriff's station, Detective Clark knew where Abraham Shakespeare had been all this time. Based on interviews and cell phone data collected throughout the missing persons investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on April 9, 2009, when Abraham first disappeared. On that night, Abraham drove his car down a road in an upscale neighborhood in a town about 20 minutes away from his house in Lakeland. Abraham had spent much of the day talking to Dee Dee on camera, and he was still thinking about getting away from Florida and kind of dropping off the map for a while. But before he did anything drastic, he wanted to make sure he had enough cash on hand to just disappear. And he hoped to avoid leaving a paper trail as much as possible, so it would be harder for people to track him down. So Abraham was on his way to the house of someone who owed him money and who had told Abraham that they had thousands of dollars in cash that they could give him. While Abraham wound his way through the neighborhood, the person he was going to see sat inside their house and waited for Abraham to arrive. And a few minutes later, they saw the headlights from Abraham's BMW outside. So they went to the front door, stood in the doorway, and waved to Abraham as he stepped out of his car. When Abraham got to the door, the person he was meeting with could tell that Abraham seemed down. But they said hopefully getting some cash would cheer him up. Abraham smiled and walked inside and followed this person through their living room and into a small home office. Abraham stood in the middle of the office, and the person he was meeting with walked across the room to a floor safe standing in the corner. Then that person crouched down, they entered the combination for the lock and opened the safe. And then they just waited there for a second. Abraham asked if everything was okay, and this person said, "Yep, everything's fine. I just need to make sure I grab the right amount of money." Then this person reached into the safe, slowly stood up, turned around, and aimed a gun right at Abraham. A look of fear came across Abraham's face, but before he could turn to run, the person shot him right in the chest, and blood began to stain his white t-shirt. Then the person fired again, and this bullet grazed Abraham's heart and perforated his lung. The shooter casually walked across the room and stood over Abraham, and they watched and listened as Abraham slowly died. Then the killer put the gun back in the safe. Then they went back to Abraham's body, crouched down, took his phone out of his pocket, and slipped it into their own pocket. Then they grabbed Abraham's legs and dragged him out of the room. Abraham was skinny, but he was very tall, so dragging him through the house was not easy. But eventually they managed to pull Abraham to the back door, and then they dragged him out into the backyard. A fence surrounded the yard, and it was totally dark out there except for some moonlight. So the killer did not feel like anyone could see them, so they didn't rush. They bent over, caught their breath, and then picked up a shovel that was laying in the grass. Then they started digging a hole in the middle of the yard. Finally, when the hole was deep enough, they walked over to Abraham's body, grabbed him by the legs, dragged him across the yard, and dumped him into the hole. Then they took the shovel and filled the hole back in. Later that night, they cleaned the bloodstains from inside their house and out in the yard, and then they found a phone number of a construction company that they planned to call the next day to place a concrete slab over the hole where they had just buried Abraham. Then the killer went into the living room, hooked up their video camera to the television, and watched the recording they had made with Abraham earlier that day. Dee Dee Moore, Abraham's friend who was an aspiring writer, had murdered Abraham. It turned out that months before the murder, she had convinced Abraham to give her control of his finances, and she had promised to play the bad guy and collect money from all of Abraham's friends and family who owed him. And she even agreed to hold on to a large amount of Abraham's cash for him in her safe so he wouldn't be tempted to just hand it out to people who asked him for money. And because Dee Dee was a successful business owner, Abraham had believed she would be better at managing money and collecting debts than he could ever be. So he thanked Dee Dee for her help and put her in charge of millions of dollars in cash and assets. And Dee Dee had collected money from people who owed Abraham, but instead of giving the money to Abraham, she kept it for herself. And she spent that money and some of the cash Abraham had given her on a brand new huge Hummer vehicle and other expensive items she wanted. And for months, Dee Dee had gotten away with it without anyone suspecting anything. But then, in the spring of 2009, not long before the murder, one of Abraham's friends started to catch on to what Dee Dee was doing. Because even though he was making regular payments to Dee Dee to clear his debts with Abraham, she kept asking him for more money. And when he got angry and said he had already paid what he owed, Dee Dee worried he would tell Abraham, and Abraham would find out that she had been stealing his money. So Dee Dee decided she would just get rid of Abraham, but keep collecting the money people owed him for herself. But in order to do that, she had to make it seem like Abraham was alive and just wanted his distance. And so when she filmed him on her camera, claiming it was for her book and movie, even though in reality she had no aspirations to write Abraham's story, she intentionally steered the conversation to how tired and frustrated he must be, and when Abraham talked about wanting to escape to a foreign beach, Dee Dee knew it was time to put her plan into motion. So she told Abraham to come to her house to get thousands of dollars in cash that she'd been holding for him in her safe, and when he arrived, she killed him and then used his phone to text his friends and family, and then she showed some of his friends and family the video recording of Abraham where he was talking about how he wanted to leave Florida and go to a beach somewhere and just kind of disappear and be left alone. And so naturally, his friends and family believed that that was what happened to Abraham. He had chosen to kind of go away. And Dee Dee almost got away with it. But once Abraham was dead, Dee Dee became relentless in her pursuit of his cousin Cedric, and she called Cedric and came to his house all the time, demanding he pay back all of the money he owed Abraham, and Cedric just wasn't going to do that. And so finally, Cedric got fed up with Dee Dee, and he filed a missing persons report. Now, Cedric did not actually believe that Abraham was dead, but by alleging that he had been murdered and pointing at Dee Dee as potentially the murderer, he knew that would launch a police investigation into Dee Dee, and that would get her off of his back for at least a while. And when Detective Clark got a record of Abraham's text messages, he was shocked at how well written and how formal they were. After all, he knew that Abraham still struggled with reading and writing. Then, when Abraham supposedly called his mother on the day after Christmas, Detective Clark got confirmation that what he believed had been going on was going on. Somebody in town had been using Abraham's phone and had been pretending to be him. And when Clark traced Abraham's phone to the mall parking lot, he and the other detective saw Dee Dee leaning into a car, handing over cash to a man and taking a phone back from him. And when they chased that man down, he admitted that he was a friend of Abraham's who Dee Dee had paid to call Abraham's mom and pretend to be Abraham. And the man had told Abraham's mom on this call that he was fighting a winter cold to make up for the fact that he didn't really sound like Abraham. Not long after that, Abraham's cousin Cedric came back to the sheriff's station, and he admitted that someone had paid him to deliver the greeting card that Abraham supposedly wrote to his mother. And it would turn out that the money Cedric was paid to make that delivery could be traced back to Dee Dee. And so Cedric had been right about Dee Dee all along without actually knowing it. With all of this new information, and with Abraham's phone records, police determined that every text message that had been sent from Abraham's phone since he disappeared had actually been sent by Dee Dee. And eventually, they learned that Dee Dee had hired a construction company to lay a concrete slab down in her backyard. So, on January 27, 2010, over 9 months after Abraham's murder, police went to Dee Dee's house, and they broke up the concrete slab out back, dug up the ground underneath, and found the skeletal remains of Abraham Shakespeare. And pieces of the t-shirt and jeans that Abraham had been wearing in the video that Dee Dee recorded on the day she killed him were still clinging to his bones. Dee Dee was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Abraham was given a proper burial, and his family was finally able to grieve. And his murder helped lead to a new Florida law that keeps the identities of large jackpot lottery winners private for 90 days. And in a telephone interview from prison, Dee Dee surprised reporters and said she strongly supported this new law.
On April 28, 2000, a 24-year-old named Yuri Lipsky was standing in front of a cafe in Dahab, Egypt, overlooking the Red Sea. He had traveled all the way to the Sinai Peninsula from Moscow in order to film himself swimming through the Arch, but now it was looking like that probably wasn't going to happen. The Arch is an 85-foot-long underwater tunnel that connects a massive sinkhole right on Dahab's shoreline called the Blue Hole to the Red Sea. To get to the Arch, you need to enter the Blue Hole directly and descend straight down 181 feet, where you'll reach the top of the tunnel on the northeast side. But there's a catch. If on your descent you happen to miss the ceiling of this arch, which apparently it's pretty easy to do, you run the risk of going too deep. Now, going too deep does not mean you're going to miss the tunnel altogether. The arch actually starts at 181 feet, but then goes all the way down to 393 feet. So it's a huge, huge opening. The risk of going too deep has to do with how your body responds to the type of gas you're breathing. For those who are unfamiliar with diving, generally speaking, you have two types of dives. There's recreational diving, where you breathe the same air that you breathe on the surface. They literally jam air directly into scuba bottles. You breathe that, and you go down to 130 feet. That's the recommended bottom depth that you would go down breathing regular air. And then there is technical diving, where you breathe a special mixture of gases. Typically, it's going to be a mixture of helium, nitrogen, and oxygen that allow you to go below 130 feet. This type of diving is exponentially more dangerous and requires all sorts of additional training. Because the minimum depth you would need to go to in order to access the arch is 181 feet, that puts you well in the technical diving range, which means you should be diving mixed gas and have special training and equipment. But year after year, people try to dive down to the arch and go through it on regular air. And year after year, people die doing it. When your body absorbs too much nitrogen, you can get something called nitrogen narcosis, which is a lot like being drunk. And in extreme cases, divers who get this have been known to remove their mouthpiece and inhale water, believing they are actually on the surface. Below 130 feet, your body absorbs nitrogen much faster, and regular air is a whopping 78% nitrogen. So the risk of getting nitrogen narcosis is exponentially higher if you're breathing regular air below 130 feet. Also, oxygen can become toxic the deeper you go in the water column. It can lead to blackouts and convulsions that if you don't have someone there to literally physically move you up in the water column, you won't recover from it and you'll die. Regular air contains 21% oxygen, which is a lot of oxygen. So if you're diving regular air below 130 feet, you are at an increased risk of developing O2 toxicity. Now, to be clear, it is possible on regular air to dive down to 181 feet and make it through the arch and come out the other side and be just fine. But you're realistically at 181 feet pushing the absolute boundary of what you can get away with on regular air. Below 200 feet, you're probably dead. So if you're attempting to swim through the arch on regular air, you need to be paying very close attention to your depth as you descend so that you don't miss the arch and accidentally drift down below 181 feet to the very deadly 200 feet and beyond. So earlier in the day, Yuri had gone down to the edge of the blue hole and he had found one of the diving instructors that taught inside the blue hole. His name was Cedric, and he asked him if he'd be willing to take him down to the arch to help him film himself going through the arch. And Cedric said, yes, but I need to train you for 2 weeks before you're going to be considered qualified to do that. And you need a special setup with a special gas mixture to do this dive. And Yuri was like, well, I'm leaving in 2 days to head back to Moscow, so I need to do this dive now. Is there any way you can do it today or tomorrow even? And Cedric was like, no, that's not how this works. And Cedric understood this more than anybody else, because in addition to teaching diving at the blue hole, Cedric's job was to dive down to the bottom and retrieve the dead bodies of inexperienced or overconfident divers that attempted the archway and didn't make it. Although there is not an official body count of how many people have perished inside of the blue hole, locals believe it's as high as 200 people just in the last decade. After Cedric was unwilling to take him without properly training him and outfitting him with the right equipment, Yuri thanked him and went on to a couple different other diving instructors with the same request. Will you take me in the next couple of days? And they all said, no, we need to train you and you need special equipment. And so finally, after no one was willing to do this, Yuri just left. Later that day, owners of cafes that overlooked the blue hole remember seeing a young man who was by himself walk to the edge of the blue hole. He puts on all of his scuba gear, he puts on a helmet and then straps a big camera to the top and ratchets it down. And then after he's got all his stuff on, he jumps into the blue hole and he disappears. That man was Yuri. A few days later, Yuri's family back home in Moscow did not see him get off the flight he was supposed to be on, and they reported him missing. Cedric was contacted to go down into the blue hole and see if Yuri was down there. Cedric hopped in the blue hole, he went to the bottom, and sure enough, lying face down at the bottom was Yuri. When they brought Yuri to the surface, they realized his camera had been running the whole time, and he had actually filmed his final moments. Yuri's final video exists online so you can watch it for yourself, but here is a description of what happens. After situating his camera on his head just the way he wanted it, he hit record, and then he jumped into the water. It was determined later on that Yuri was breathing regular air out of his tanks. The camera submerges under the water, and then Yuri begins to sink very quickly into the blue hole. But his breathing seems normal, and he's not thrashing around, so it seems like it's a controlled descent. But at some point, you hear Yuri trying to activate his buoyancy compensator. Basically, it's this life jacket, to describe it simply, that sits on your gear that you have a demand valve where you can inflate and deflate the air into it to neutralize your buoyancy. Or, in an emergency situation, you can fully inflate it and stop yourself from sinking. In fact, you'll rise to the surface. But he's trying to activate his buoyancy compensator to slow down his descent, and the air is escaping his compensator. There's a leak, and he can't slow down his descent. Now, Yuri was wearing a weight belt, which is very common in diving. In fact, I don't really know of all that many dives that you wouldn't use a weight belt. And any diver knows that there is a quick release function on your weight belt. Specifically, if you're in an uncontrolled descent or if you're in an emergency situation and need to get to the surface, you can jettison your weight belt and go to the surface. But Yuri was panicking and he was fixated on his buoyancy compensator that he was desperately trying to activate, and it was failing. And so he's not going for his weight belt. And then he rockets past the entrance to the arch. So he goes below 181 feet, he goes below 200 feet, and he goes all the way to the bottom where he hits the bottom at 392 feet. And then he begins to slide because the bottom of the blue hole was actually at an angle, and that archway went all the way to the bottom of the hole. And if you slipped out of the blue hole, it was a sheer drop off for thousands of feet. And you see on camera, Yuri rolls over and he's desperately clawing into the mud to stop himself from sliding out of the blue hole to definite death. And he's trying to get himself to stop, and finally he anchors himself in the dirt. And it's calm for a second, and he's kind of looking around. It's very clear he's confused, and then it goes still. And it's believed at this point he either removed his mouthpiece because of nitrogen narcosis, he pulled it out and inhaled water, or he was dealing with O2 toxicity and he blacked out and the mouthpiece came out. But either way, he drowned. Our next story is called Drown or Glory. There is a remote cliff face in northern England that rarely gets tourists. If you were standing in front of it, you would see this little stream that went into a break in the limestone. It's this little tiny hole, and that stream is called the Mossdale Beck. If you crouched down and walked through that hole, you would be entering the Mossdale Caverns, which since 1967 have been permanently sealed off to cavers. Once inside the Mossdale Caverns entranceway, you could look down and see that little stream, the Mossdale Beck, would be going between your legs, and then right in front of you, it would split in two distinct directions down respective tunnels. To the right, the water flows down 7 miles of accessible passageway. However, most of it is incredibly tight and it's prone to flooding. As a result, fewer people have seen the far reaches of the right side of Mossdale Cavern than have stepped on the moon. To the left, the water goes through these impenetrable rocks that no one has gotten past. In fact, no one knows what's beyond these rocks. However, scientists have determined the water that goes left at the entranceway will re-emerge 18 days later, 5 miles away, 900 feet lower in a pool called the Black Keld. The massive tunnel system that we know exists but has yet to be explored that connects the entranceway to Black Keld is referred to as the missing link. You would think cavers from all over the world would be clamoring to get inside that accessible side, the right side of Mossdale Caverns, and try to find a secret access point back to the missing link, to be the first person to discover that, to stake your claim and say, that was me. But in fact, since the Mossdale Caverns was discovered in 1941 until 1967, almost no one went in Mossdale Caverns. Endless, tight, water-filled crawls with names like Drown or Glory made Mossdale Caverns feel like too big of a risk to be worth it. But in 1967, 10 extremely fit, extremely experienced cavers said, you know what? We are going in Mossdale Cavern and we are going to find that entrance to the missing link. So on June 24th, 1967, these 10 cavers entered Mossdale Caverns. They went right into the accessible 7 miles of passageway and they began their descent. And it wasn't that long until 2 of the 10 cavers, the 2 least experienced of the group, said, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. Got a bad feeling about this, but we don't know the way out. And so they needed chaperones to leave. And so 2 other cavers from the group had to go with them. So 4 cavers, they leave Mossdale Caverns. The other 6 are going to continue on. So when the 4 got back to the surface, it was about 5 p.m. They had been in the cavern for several hours at this point. And when they went in initially, the weather was great. It was beautiful. It was clear. Now they're coming out again and it had started to rain. Not significantly, it was more like a drizzle, but they were a little bit concerned because they knew the other 6 were planning to be in the cavern until after midnight. So they were just hopeful that the rain did not get any worse. But just a couple of hours later, the skies opened up and it rained like it hadn't rained in years. Just torrential downpour, and the 4 were really concerned about the other 6. So they went back to the entrance hoping that maybe, the other 6 would have heard the rain, although it's very unlikely considering how deep they were going to be. But they were hoping that maybe they'd be coming out again and they would see them and get them back to safety. But when they arrived there, not only were the 6 not out of the cave, but the actual entrance to the cave was completely submerged in water. Earlier that day, when the 4 cavers turned around and left, the other 6 cavers, they continued on, and they had made it about 2 miles deep into these caves. They had passed the fabled Drown or Glory swim, they had survived the knee wrecker passage, and they had bit their tongue as they squeezed through the famously painful Umaguli tunnel. Now located hours away from the only way out. So they are way into this cave. They were nearing the end of this distant section of the cave that they believed on the other end, they would find this hidden entrance into the missing link. All they had to do was pass through the Far Marathon section, which is a 900-foot tunnel that is only 10 inches high, 2 feet wide, and you have to wriggle through on your stomach with your face pressed against a stream that runs through it. And it takes a very long time to get through it. It's incredibly claustrophobia inducing. It's considered one of the most stressful things you can do in caving. But considering how experienced these cavers were and the fact that they had come down there specifically to get to this far point in the cave, you got to figure that their spirits were high. They were probably joking with each other as they're doing this awful thing. And then they made it about 3/4 of the way through this tunnel when someone must have noticed the distant rumbling sound and said, "Hey, what is that?" And as they sat there listening, trying to discern what the sound was, it must have dawned on them that their worst nightmare was about to come true. That was the sound of surging water. This tunnel is about to flood. They began crawling faster and faster down the marathon tunnel. Not only was it very difficult to move quickly inside of this very tight tunnel, but they also knew there was nowhere to go. They're 2 miles underground. They must have felt like the world of sunshine and fresh air was suddenly an eternity away. The oldest of the group was 26, the rest of them were all in their teens. United now by fear, the water came rushing in as they're all pinned inside of the far marathon tunnel, and their face is already up against the river, and now this river is surging with water. And so they're all desperately trying to crawl through this flooding tunnel, and the leader of the group, the guy literally in the front, John Ogden, who was 26, he managed to get all the way through the far marathon tunnel to the space where they anticipated finding that secret entrance into the missing link. That wasn't there, but he found above him there was a small fissure in the rocks. There was an air pocket, and he managed to get his head up into the space right as the water in the far marathon cave completely submerged. So any of the cavers in there, they drowned inside of the far marathon. The bubble that he was in was a little bit bigger, and so some of the cavers managed to get in there, and they tried to clamber into this air pocket as well, but ultimately there was only enough room for one person, and John was the only one up there. And so as the water levels filled the room he was in up to his neck, everyone below John drowned. Now, we don't know if John literally kept other people from getting into this air pocket with him. All we know is it could only hold one person, and ultimately John was the one who was left inside of this crevice. But this air pocket was really just delaying the inevitable because there wasn't very much air inside of it, and John's 2 miles below the surface. There is no way anyone is going to get to him in time. And so he ended up dying a couple days later, and when they found him, he was still in the air pocket trying to get one last breath. What I've not covered in this story that I would encourage you all to check out is there was this incredible effort to try to save these cavers before anyone knew they were deceased. There was this hope that maybe they found an air pocket and they were still alive. And so they basically created this artificial dam that was very precarious. The water could at any moment spill over, and it provided just enough drainage inside of this cavern for some of the best cavers in the world to go into the cavern to look for them. And so they went into this cavern knowing at any minute that makeshift dam on the surface could break and they will 100% drown in here. No one's coming to get them. They had to crawl through the far marathon tunnel all the way down at the bottom to get to the lost cavers. And ultimately, when they discovered they were all deceased, it would have been impossible to remove their bodies. And so the decision was made to leave the 6 cavers where they died and seal off the cave permanently. So in 1967, they sealed it off, and they now treat Mossdale Caverns like a gravesite, and no one goes in it.
The next and final story of today's episode is called 10 Years Later.
For any diver who can stomach the risks, Bushman's Hole is a world-class diving spot. It's located on a privately owned game farm in South Africa. In the middle of the farm's 11,000 acres sits this massive crater in the ground that from rim to rim is hundreds of feet wide. If you hike down the crater to the middle, there's this little tiny basin of water that almost looks like an oversized puddle. This is the entrance to Bushman's Hole. Once you step into this little puddle and push your way through the very claustrophobia-inducing entrance, you open up into the biggest freshwater cave in the world that goes down to nearly 900 feet. For the people that have been in there, they say it's unbelievable and it's like spacewalking. For young South African Dion Dreyer, the pull to go to Bushman and explore it was irresistible. Dion had always been a bit of an adrenaline junkie. By the time he was 17, he was racing cars and building motorcycles, and by the time he was 20, he had picked up a new activity, cave diving. Dion had logged about 200 dives before he was invited by a diving group to go to Bushman's Hole and explore it on Christmas break 1994. They were planning a descent to 492 feet, so about the halfway point of the cave, and they needed one more diver, and so Dion was thrilled to go. The dive was going great, but on the way up, as they were making their ascent, the diver ahead of Dion looked back at him, and Dion seemed fine. He gave the hand signal that everything was going great. He had his flashlight out, and then about 30 feet higher in the water, that same diver turned around to check on Dion, and Dion wasn't there anymore. And in fact, this guy saw his flashlight that was still attached to him, basically wavering as it sunk farther and farther down Bushman's Hole. This diver immediately stops the group above him, and he turns around and starts swimming as fast as he can down to try to get to Dion. But Dion was sinking so quickly that this diver realized that it's a suicide mission if I try to go down there. I will either pass out or run out of air. And so deeply saddened, this group of divers had to turn around and leave Dion at the bottom of Bushman's Hole. Although the other divers didn't know for sure, they told Dion's parents that most likely he had suffered from a deep water blackout and then had drowned. When authorities were notified about what happened to Dion, they sent a robot down to the bottom of Bushman's Hole to just locate his body before they sent a person down there. But they never could find his body, they could only ever find his helmet. Dion's parents are devastated. They're never going to see their son again. And since they don't have a body to bury, they decide to go down to Bushman's Hole and put a plaque up next to the entrance to commemorate their son. 10 years later, Dave Shaw, who was a 50-year-old extremely audacious cave diver, was passing the 800-foot mark inside of Bushman's Hole, becoming the third person ever to reach this depth. Shaw touched down on the sloping bottom of the cave. He detached from the cave reel, took out his flashlight, and began swimming around the bottom. As he was scanning around, he looked about 50 feet to his left, and he saw something he immediately recognized. It was a human body. They were on their back with their arms stretched out towards the surface, and when Shaw went over to them, he immediately recognized that this is Dion Dreyer. Ever since Dion died inside of Bushman and had never been recovered, any diver that went in there was keeping their eye out in case they saw him. Shaw examines Dion to see if he's going to be able to be pulled to the surface, if he's solid enough to be pulled to the surface, and he can tell that his hands have skeletonized as well as his skull, although his mask is still placed directly on his skull. But his wetsuit and his tanks had kind of kept the rest of his body pretty tight, which gave him some mass, which meant he'd be able to move him. But as soon as Shaw tried to move him, he couldn't get him to budge because his tanks were caught on something. And so Shaw stayed there for a minute trying to get him free, but he couldn't do it. And that's when Shaw started to think, okay, this is getting irresponsible. I'm going to die down here too if I don't start making my ascent soon. So he ended up tying a line to Dion's body so he could be located again. And then Shaw began the very slow ascent back to the surface. On the way back up, Shaw felt an extreme sense of connection with Dion. He really felt bad for this kid, and all he wanted to do was get him back on land to give back to his family, to give them some closure. And so when he got on the surface, he immediately contacted authorities and said, I'm going to go back down and I'm going to get him. And Shaw also called Dion's parents and told them, I am going to retrieve your son. And his parents were apparently overjoyed. They couldn't believe they were going to get to see their son again. After lots and lots of planning, Shaw's recovery of Dion was scheduled for January 8th, 2005. The dive was going to take 12 hours, and it wasn't just going to be Dave doing the retrieval. It was going to be like a relay race. Dave would be the first one down, and a couple minutes after he entered the water, another diver would go in who would stop about 100 feet above Dave, and then a third diver would go in and stop 100 feet above the second diver, and so on and so forth. Dave would put the body bag over Dion and then carry his body up to the first guy, who would turn around, bring the body up to the next guy, and the next guy to the next guy until Dion was out of the water. At 6:13 in the morning, Shaw entered the water with a camera on his helmet to film the operation. Shortly after he submerged, Dion's parents walked down to the edge of the water to watch. They showed up intentionally late so as not to put added pressure on Shaw. Shaw dropped very quickly to the bottom of Bushman's Hole. He actually arrived about a minute and a half faster than he expected to. As soon as he got down, he shined his light and he found Dion's body. He went over to him, he got the body bag out, and he got to work. 13 minutes after Shaw had submerged, the diver who was slotted above him, that would be the first to receive Dion's body, began looking for signs that Shaw was done and was moving up towards him. But when he looked down, he saw Shaw's flashlight wasn't moving. This diver continued to watch the flashlight very intently to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. And after a couple of minutes and still no movement, this diver begins going deeper and deeper to try to get a better look at Shaw to see what's going on. And when he got a little bit closer, it became very clear that Shaw was not moving. This diver immediately goes into rescue mode and starts going straight down to get to Shaw to try to help him if he still can. And as he's moving down, he hears this fizzling sound and he looks at his wrist and he can tell that one of his gauges has broken. And this gauge was vital to the dive and it meant he would not be able to get down there. And so with a heavy heart, he had to turn around and go back up. And because of the depth at which they were diving, he could not just go right to the surface and tell everybody what had happened. He needed to stop at various decompression stops along the way. But he had a slate, and on it he wrote in his grease pen, "Dave's not coming back." and he swam the slate up to the next diver who would have received Dion's body, but instead receives the slate. He takes the slate up to the next diver, to the next diver, to the next diver, all the way up to the surface. As soon as this message was read out loud to the group standing around Bushman's Hole, which included Dion's parents, there was 30 seconds of stunned silence. No one could believe this was happening. And then after the silence, Dion's parents are beside themselves. Not only are they not going to see their son probably ever again, but they feel like they are somehow responsible for Shaw's death. Eventually, by the end of the night, all of the other divers that were in the water that day successfully exited the cave and were just fine. As for Shaw, much like Dion, there really wasn't a good way to get him out, and so everyone came to terms with the reality that he was going to be down there with Dion probably forever. The news was so devastating that the team decided to leave all their equipment in place. Eventually, they did need to go down and collect their gear, so everybody goes down to the edge of Bushman's Hole, and before they begin retrieving all of the lines, they sang Amazing Grace in memoriam for the lost diver. Afterwards, they started pulling up the lines, and as they're doing that, they notice all these bubbles coming up from the bottom of the cave. And they looked a little bit closer, and it was Shaw's body and Dion's body. Basically, Shaw had been attached to this line, and he had managed to free Dion before he had passed. And so when they pulled the line, both of them were freed, and they floated to the surface. And so even though Shaw would die doing it, he was able to get Dion out of Bushman's Cave for his family. After the two bodies were taken out, they noticed that the camera on Dave's head was still intact, and it had filmed everything all the way through his final moments. And so they took the tape out, and they watched it forward and backwards, slow-mo, frame by frame, and they analyzed it to the point where they understood what happened. When Shaw gets down to Dion, Dion's body that had previously been stuck, and that was the reason Shaw had not been able to free him the first time, somehow he's become unfree, and he's now free-floating. And Shaw is having a really hard time trying to control this free-floating body, and his body is literally breaking apart in front of him. As Shaw is trying to wrangle his body, you can hear him start grunting, his breathing is getting elevated, and he's totally losing control of the situation, and the bottom of this cave is slanted, and it's all silty and muddy, and so in the camera you see all this mud and silt getting kicked around, and the visibility is very poor, and after it clears, you see Shaw has gotten completely tangled in some line that's also tangled on Dion. So basically, Dion has become his anchor. At this point, Shaw shifts his focus to try to get the lines off of himself, and you can hear his breathing now is becoming much more desperate. It almost sounds like he's gulping for air, and probably at this point, although we don't know for sure, he's suffering from narcosis, which is a condition that divers will run into, where it's like you've drank a whole bunch of alcohol on an empty stomach. It's like you're totally drunk and you're confused, and it's clear that he's becoming a little bit disoriented. And instead of going away from Dion's body to try to go back up and save yourself, instead, he turns and starts fumbling with Dion's midsection, and then he gets out a pair of scissors, but he doesn't use them, he just holds them. Finally, he turns away from Dion because it's clear you're not going to be able to get him out at this point, and with the scissors in hand that he never used, because again, he's probably suffering from narcosis and he's confused, he starts beginning to make his way over to the area where you can go back up. But he starts slowing down, his breathing becomes tragically desperate, and then it becomes silent, and then there's no more movement, and Dave Shaw is dead. 10 days after the bodies were recovered from Bushman's Hole, Dion's parents, although they are absolutely devastated about what happened to Shaw, and they feel very guilty, but at the same time, they're so excited because they get to go to the morgue and see their son again for the first time in 10 years. They don't care what state his body's in. Just the fact that he's actually here, that their actual son is going to be in front of them, was just overwhelming for them. And when they went in, they were really fixated on the fact that he had underwear on that they both recognized. Apparently they had bought him a set of jockey underwear, and he was wearing jockey underwear. As strange as it is, it was like they got to bond with their child one more time. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please line the floor of the Amazon Music Follow Button's bedroom with Lego pieces, then set off their fire alarm. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballin.foundation and click Get Involved